Picture this. You're a decorated military pilot, trained to handle the most sophisticated combat aircraft in the world. You've spent years mastering the controls of an Apache helicopter, a machine worth $35 million that can rain destruction from the sky. You've saved countless lives, completed impossible missions, and earned the respect of your peers. Then, in one moment of judgment, everything changes. One decision, one mistake. One act of defiance that gets you stripped of your wings and confined to base. Your flying days are over. Your squadron moves on without you. You're relegated to paperwork and watching others do what you were born to do. But what happens when those same people who grounded you suddenly need you most? What happens when your former squadron is trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded, outgunned, and facing certain death? What happens when you're the only one who can reach them, but the only way to do it is to steal the very aircraft you're banned from flying? This is the story of Captain Sarah Mitchell, a woman who discovered that sometimes being grounded doesn't mean you stop flying. It means you learn what's truly worth taking off for. Sometimes the greatest heroes are born not from following orders, but from knowing exactly when to break them. Captain Sarah Mitchell had always believed that the sky belonged to those brave enough to claim it. For 12 years, she had proven that belief every time she climbed into the cockpit of her Apache helicopter. The machine responded to her touch like a living thing, its twin engines roaring to life at her command, its weapon systems dancing under her fingertips with deadly precision. Sarah wasn't just any pilot. She was the best in the 1st Battalion, 227th Aviation Regiment. Her record spoke for itself. Over 800 combat hours, 47 successful rescue missions, and 0 casualties under her watch. When other pilots talked about flying, they spoke of technical maneuvers and tactical advantages. When Sarah talked about flying, she spoke of poetry written in the clouds, of finding freedom in the controlled chaos of combat. The desert sun was merciless that Tuesday morning at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, somewhere in the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan. Sarah had been awake since 0400, running her pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision she'd maintained for over a decade. Her Apache, tail number 0618471, sat on the tarmac like a predator waiting to hunt. The aircraft was her partner, her weapon, and her sanctuary all rolled into one sleek, terrifying package. "Mitchell, you're cleared for Patrol Sector 7, came the voice of her commanding officer, Colonel James Patterson, over the radio. Patterson was a by-the-book commander who respected Sarah's abilities but never quite trusted her independent streak. He'd been warning her for months about her tendency to interpret orders rather than simply follow them. The morning patrol started routinely. Sarah and her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Rivera, lifted off into the clear desert sky, their mission simple: reconnaissance and area denial in the disputed territory near the Pakistani border. The landscape below them was a patchwork of ancient riverbeds, rocky outcroppings, and scattered villages that had witnessed centuries of conflict. Rivera was young, eager, and still impressed by Sarah's reputation. He'd requested to fly with her specifically, hoping to learn from one of the most decorated pilots in the regiment. As they cruised at 500 feet, he peppered her with questions about combat techniques and tactical decisions. "Captain, what's the most important thing about flying an Apache?" Rivera asked through the intercom. Sarah smiled beneath her helmet. "Knowing when not to fly it," she replied, a response that would prove prophetic within hours. The call came at 11:47 hours. Intelligence had identified a high-value target moving through a convoy in their patrol sector. 3 vehicles possibly carrying a Taliban commander responsible for several attacks on coalition forces. The order was clear: observe and report. Do not engage without explicit authorization. Sarah positioned the Apache for optimal surveillance, using the aircraft's advanced sensors to track the convoy as it wound through the narrow mountain passes. Through her targeting system, she could see armed men in the vehicles, weapons clearly visible. But something else caught her attention. In the last vehicle, she spotted what appeared to be civilian prisoners, their hands bound, faces showing clear signs of distress. "Base, this is Apache 77, Sarah radioed. "I have eyes on the convoy, confirming 3 vehicles with armed personnel. But I'm also seeing what appears to be civilian hostages in the rear vehicle." The response was immediate and firm. "Apache 77, maintain observation. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Ground forces are en route to your position." Sarah watched through her targeting system as the convoy stopped in a small village. The armed men began herding the bound civilians out of the vehicles. Even from her altitude, she could see the terror on their faces. Women and children, their hands tied behind their backs, being forced toward a building that intelligence had previously identified as a Taliban stronghold. Base, the hostages are being moved into a fortified position, Sarah reported, her voice tense. If we wait for ground forces, these people are going to die. Negative, Apache 77. You are ordered to maintain position and observe only. Ground forces will handle the situation. Sarah looked at the tactical display. Ground forces were still 45 minutes out. In her experience, hostage situations like this rarely lasted that long. The Taliban fighters below weren't planning a negotiation. They were preparing an execution. Rivera sensed his pilot's conflict. "Captain, orders are orders," he said quietly. Sarah's hands hovered over the weapons controls. Through her targeting system, she had a clear shot at the vehicles, at the armed fighters who were now forcing the civilians to their knees in what was clearly preparation for an execution. She'd made similar shots dozens of times before. Clean, precise, surgical strikes that saved innocent lives. "Apache 77, confirm your status," came Patterson's voice over the radio. Sarah made the decision that would change everything. "Base, I have clear shots on the hostiles. I can neutralize the threat and save those civilians." "Negative, stand down." That is a direct order. Through her targeting system, Sarah watched as one of the fighters raised his weapon toward a kneeling woman. Time slowed. Every fiber of her training, every instinct honed over years of combat screamed at her to act. She'd joined the military to protect innocents, to stand between evil and those who couldn't protect themselves. She squeezed the trigger. The Hellfire missile streaked from the Apache with deadly accuracy, striking the lead vehicle and eliminating 3 fighters instantly. Sarah immediately repositioned, acquiring the remaining targets. 2 more missiles, 2 more precise strikes. In less than 30 seconds, the threat was neutralized and the hostages were free. "Apache 77, what is your status?" Patterson's voice was ice cold. "Threat neutralized, base. Hostages are secure." The silence that followed lasted an eternity. When Patterson finally responded, his voice carried the weight of consequences Sarah was only beginning to understand. "Apache 77, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Upon landing, you will surrender your aircraft to maintenance and report to my office for disciplinary action. You have directly disobeyed a lawful order in a combat zone." The flight back to base was the longest of Sarah's career. Rivera sat silent in the co-pilot seat, understanding that he'd just witnessed something that would define both their careers. Below them, the rescued hostages were being tended to by the ground forces that had finally arrived. Sarah had saved their lives, but she knew she'd also ended her own flying career. The disciplinary hearing took place 3 days later. Sarah sat at attention in Colonel Patterson's office, her dress uniform crisp, her medals catching the harsh fluorescent light. Across from her sat not only Patterson but also Major General Rebecca Hayes, the commanding officer of the entire aviation brigade. "Captain Mitchell," General Hayes began, her voice carrying decades of military authority, "you stand accused of willfully disobeying direct orders in a combat zone, engaging enemy targets without authorization, and endangering coalition operations through unauthorized use of lethal force." Sarah maintained her composure. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand the gravity of these charges?" "I do, ma'am." "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Sarah looked directly at the general. "When I saw those civilians about to be executed, and I had the power to stop it, I acted according to that oath." Patterson leaned forward. "You acted in direct contradiction to lawful orders, Captain. Orders that exist to prevent exactly the kind of international incident your actions could have caused. Sir, those hostages are alive today because I acted, and coalition operations in this sector are compromised because you couldn't follow simple instructions." Patterson shot back. General Hayes held up her hand for silence. "Captain Mitchell, your actions saved 11 civilian lives. No one in this room questions your bravery or your intentions. But military discipline exists for a reason. Orders exist for a reason. When individual soldiers decide for themselves which orders to follow, the entire command structure breaks down." Sarah knew what was coming. She'd known since the moment she pulled that trigger. "You are hereby relieved of flight status. Effective immediately," General Hayes continued. "Your flying privileges are suspended pending a full investigation. You will be confined to base and assigned to administrative duties until further notice." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Flying wasn't just what she did, it was who she was. The Apache wasn't just a machine, it was an extension of her soul. Being grounded was like being told she could no longer breathe. "Ma'am," Sarah said quietly, "request permission to speak freely." General Hayes nodded. "I understand the consequences of my actions. I accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate, but I want it on record that I would make the same decision again. Those people deserve to live, and I had the power to make that happen. Patterson's face reddened. Captain, your self-righteousness is exactly why you're being grounded. You think the rules don't apply to you. No, sir, Sarah replied. I think some things are more important than rules. The meeting ended with Sarah's flight wings being formally removed. As she walked out of the building, still in her dress uniform but no longer authorized to fly, she felt like she was walking away from everything that had ever mattered to her. Her quarters at the base felt like a prison cell. Sarah sat on her narrow bunk, staring at the flight helmet she was no longer authorized to wear. Outside her window, she could hear the familiar sound of Apache rotors spinning up as other pilots prepared for missions she would never fly again. Lieutenant Rivera found her there 2 hours later. He knocked on her doorframe, still uncertain about how to approach the pilot who had been his mentor and was now persona non grata. Captain, he said quietly, I wanted you to know what you did out there. It was the right thing. Sarah looked up at him. Tell that to the General, Rivera. I mean it. Those civilians are alive because you made the hard choice. That has to count for something. Apparently not enough. Rivera shifted uncomfortably. There's something else. The squadron's been talking. About what happened, about why you're being punished. Most of us think you got screwed. Sarah stood up, walking to her small window. Rivera, let me give you some advice. Don't let my situation affect your career. Follow orders. Play by the rules. Don't end up like me. But Captain, no buts, Lieutenant. I made my choice, and now I'm paying for it. Learn from my mistake. As Rivera left, Sarah remained at the window, watching the sun set over the desert landscape that had been her domain for so many years. She'd always believed that being a pilot meant having the freedom to soar above the constraints that bound others to the ground. Now she understood that sometimes the price of doing what's right is losing the very thing that defines you. The base grew quiet as evening fell. In the distance, Sarah could see the silhouettes of Apache helicopters on the flight line, their rotor blades folded like the wings of sleeping eagles. Those machines had been her life, her purpose, her identity. Now they were just reminders of everything she'd lost. As she prepared for her first night as a grounded pilot, Sarah had no way of knowing that in just 48 hours those same aircraft would become her only hope of saving the lives of the very people who had taken away her wings. Sometimes fate has a twisted sense of irony, and sometimes redemption comes in the form of the very thing that destroyed you in the first place. Sarah Mitchell closed her eyes and tried to imagine a future without flying. She couldn't. What she didn't yet know was that her flying days weren't over. They were just beginning under circumstances she could never have imagined. 2 days after her grounding, Sarah Mitchell found herself assigned to the most humiliating duty imaginable for a combat pilot, inventory management. While her former squadron prepared for missions that could change the course of the war, she sat in a cramped office counting ammunition supplies and filing maintenance reports. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now responsible for tracking the very Hellfire missiles she was no longer authorized to fire. The morning of what would become known as Black Thursday started like any other day in her new reality. Sarah arrived at the supply depot at 0630, her flight suit replaced by standard combat utilities. The desert heat was already building, promising another scorching day that would leave everyone on base searching for shade and cold water. Master Sergeant Tony Rodriguez, the grizzled supply chief who had become her reluctant supervisor, greeted her with his usual mixture of sympathy and frustration. Rodriguez had been at the base for 3 tours and had seen plenty of good soldiers get sideways with command, but he'd never seen anyone with Sarah's reputation reduced to counting bullets. "Morning, Captain," Rodriguez said, not quite able to hide the awkwardness in his voice. "Got a special assignment for you today. We need a complete inventory of the emergency medical supplies in Hangar 7. Sarah nodded without enthusiasm. Understood, Sergeant. As she walked toward the hangar, she could hear the familiar sound of Apache rotors spinning up on the flight line. Her replacement in Bravo Flight, Captain Derek Morrison, was leading what intelligence had dubbed Operation Desert Shield. It was supposed to be a routine patrol along the Afghan-Pakistani border, the same kind of mission Sarah had flown hundreds of times. Morrison was a competent pilot, but he lacked Sarah's instinctive understanding of the Apache's capabilities. He flew by the book, which made him safe but predictable. In the unforgiving terrain where they operated, predictability could be deadly. The mission briefing that morning had outlined a standard reconnaissance patrol with possible close air support for ground forces conducting a sweep operation near the village of Coast Matern. Intelligence suggested minimal enemy activity in the area. It was supposed to be what pilots called a milk run, easy, low risk, and routine. Sarah's squadron consisted of 2 Apache helicopters, Morrison's aircraft with co-pilot Lieutenant Jessica Chen, and the second bird flown by Captain Brad Stevens with Lieutenant Rivera as his co-pilot. Stevens was another solid pilot, methodical and careful, while Rivera was still learning but showed promise. Together, they represented over 30 years of combined flying experience. As Sarah counted medical supplies in the stifling heat of the hangar, her former squadron lifted off into the morning sky. She paused in her work to listen to the fading sound of rotor blades, a sound that had once meant freedom and purpose, but now only reminded her of what she'd lost. The morning progressed with painful slowness. Sarah inventoried bandages, morphine, auto-injectors, and trauma kits, while trying not to think about the fact that her flying career was effectively over. At 36, she was young enough to transition to another specialty within the military, but the thought of spending the next 14 years until retirement doing anything other than flying felt like a slow death. At 11:30 hours, the base communication center crackled to life with routine position reports from the patrol. Morrison's voice came through clearly, professional and calm, as he updated base on their progress through the assigned sector. Base, this is Desert Shield 1. Sector sweep complete, no contacts observed. Moving to Checkpoint Bravo for refuel and rearm. Sarah found herself unconsciously listening to the radio chatter, her pilot's instincts still attuned to the rhythm of flight operations even when she was no longer part of them. She recognized the landmarks Morrison was referencing, could visualize their exact position based on his reports. The Checkpoint Bravo refueling stop was routine. Ground forces had established a forward arming and refueling point, FARP, in a secured valley that allowed helicopters to top off their fuel and ammunition without returning to the main base. Sarah had used the same FARP dozens of times during her own missions. What no one knew was that intelligence had missed something crucial about the area surrounding Checkpoint Bravo. For the past 2 weeks, a Taliban cell led by a commander named Qari Mizraman had been moving fighters into concealed positions throughout the valley. Mizraman was no ordinary insurgent. He was a former Afghan army officer who had received training in Pakistan and understood how coalition forces operated. Mizraman had been studying coalition helicopter operations for months, learning their patterns, their procedures, and their vulnerabilities. He knew that helicopters were most vulnerable during refueling operations, when they were stationary and their crews were focused on the technical aspects of the refuel rather than security. At 12:15 hours, Morrison and Stevens brought their Apaches into the FARP for what should have been a routine 20-minute refuel. The ground crew, a mix of Army aviation specialists and contract maintenance personnel, worked efficiently to service both aircraft. Morrison shut down his engines and climbed out of his cockpit to stretch his legs and coordinate with the ground team leader. It was standard procedure, something he'd done hundreds of times. Stevens remained in his cockpit, running through post-flight checks, while Rivera monitored the radio. The attack came without warning. Mirzaman had positioned his fighters in 3 groups around the valley, each armed with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. At precisely 12:27 hours, they opened fire simultaneously from multiple directions. The first RPG round struck the fuel truck that was servicing Morrison's Apache, creating a fireball that could be seen for miles. The explosion killed 2 members of the ground crew instantly and sent Morrison diving for cover behind a concrete barrier. Within seconds, heavy machine gun fire raked across the FARP, pinning down everyone in the area. Stevens tried to start his engines, but another RPG round struck his aircraft's tail section, severing hydraulic lines and making the helicopter unflyable. Base, this is Desert Shield 2. Stevens screamed into his radio. We are under heavy fire at Checkpoint Bravo. We have aircraft down. Request immediate support. Morrison, despite the chaos around him, managed to reach his aircraft and attempt to start his engines. His Apache had been damaged in the fuel truck explosion but was still potentially flyable. However, as he began his startup sequence, accurate sniper fire forced him to abandon the cockpit and take cover. The Taliban fighters had planned their ambush perfectly. They had the high ground, overlapping fields of fire, and had timed their attack for maximum vulnerability. Within minutes, they had effectively neutralized both Apache helicopters and pinned down the entire ground crew. Back at the main base, the communication center erupted in controlled chaos as the reality of the situation became clear.
Colonel Patterson found himself facing every commander's nightmare. His people were trapped, outgunned, and surrounded with no immediate way to extract them.
Sir, reported the operations officer. We have 2 aircraft down at Checkpoint Bravo. Crews are alive, but pinned down by heavy fire. The Taliban forces estimated at 30 to 40 fighters with heavy weapons. Patterson studied the tactical display showing the location of the trapped personnel. Checkpoint Bravo was 60 miles from the main base in mountainous terrain that made rapid ground response impossible. Fixed-wing support was available, but dropping bombs danger close to friendly forces was extremely risky. "What about our other rotary wing assets?" Patterson asked. "Sir, we have one Apache available, but its crew is on mandatory crew rest after a 14-hour mission yesterday. They won't be available for another 6 hours." 6 hours. Patterson knew that the trapped personnel didn't have 6 hours. Intelligence intercepts suggested that Taliban reinforcements were already moving toward the area. If they weren't extracted soon, a rescue mission would become a body recovery operation. Meanwhile, at the FARP, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Morrison had managed to establish communication with his trapped crew and ground personnel. Stevens was wounded, having taken shrapnel in his left arm when the second RPG round hit his aircraft. Rivera was uninjured, but was running low on ammunition for his sidearm. The ground crew had taken casualties as well. 2 were dead from the initial fuel truck explosion. 1 was seriously wounded with internal injuries, and the rest were pinned down in a maintenance bunker with limited defensive capabilities. Morrison tried repeatedly to reach his aircraft and get it airborne, but accurate sniper fire made any movement toward the flight line suicidal. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves to cover every possible approach to the helicopters. "Desert Shield 1 to base," Morrison radioed. "We need immediate extraction or close air support. The enemy has us completely pinned down, and we have wounded personnel who need immediate medical attention." Patterson found himself facing an impossible decision. He could order fixed-wing aircraft to strafe the area around the FARP, but the risk of hitting friendly forces was enormous. He could wait for the rested Apache crew to become available, but by then it might be too late. Ground forces were still hours away. As Patterson weighed his limited options, Sarah Mitchell was in the supply depot, completely unaware that her former squadron was fighting for their lives 60 miles away. She had finished the medical supply inventory and was starting on ammunition counts when Master Sergeant Rodriguez burst into the hangar. "Captain," Rodriguez said breathlessly, "you need to get to the operations center. Now." "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, immediately sensing the urgency in his voice. "Your old squadron, they're in trouble." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She dropped her clipboard and ran toward the operations center, her legs moving faster than they had since her grounding. As she approached the building, she could hear the controlled chaos of a rescue operation being planned. Inside the operations center, she found Patterson hunched over a radio, his face grim. Around him, staff officers were frantically coordinating possible rescue scenarios, all of which seemed to have significant drawbacks. Sarah approached Patterson cautiously. Despite their recent conflict, she was still technically one of his officers and had a right to know the situation. "Sir," she said quietly, "Sergeant Rodriguez said there was a problem with my former squadron." Patterson looked up at her, and for a moment, his anger at her past insubordination was replaced by the weight of command responsibility.
A answered friend of the commander read their question now.
"They're trapped, Mitchell. Ambushed at checkpoint Bravo. Aircraft down, crew pinned down, casualties mounting." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with crisis situations. Her mind immediately began processing tactical options, calculating distances, assessing possibilities. It was the same mental process that had made her such an effective combat pilot. "What assets do we have available for extraction?" she asked. "Nothing immediate. Our other Apache crew is on crew rest, won't be ready for hours. Fixed-wing support is available, but the risk to friendly forces is too high." Sarah studied the tactical display showing the location of Checkpoint Bravo. She knew the terrain intimately, had flown over it dozens of times. She also knew the capabilities and limitations of the Apache helicopter better than anyone on base. A thought began forming in her mind, a possibility so audacious that she initially dismissed it. But as she listened to the increasingly desperate radio calls from the trapped personnel, the idea began to take shape. There was one Apache helicopter available. One aircraft that could reach the trapped personnel in time to make a difference. The problem was that Sarah Mitchell, the only pilot immediately available who was qualified to fly it, was grounded and forbidden from any flight operations. As the situation at Checkpoint Bravo continued to deteriorate, Sarah realized she was facing a decision that would either redeem her career or end it completely. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in following orders, but in knowing exactly when those orders need to be broken. The radio crackled with another transmission from Morrison. "Base, we're taking heavy casualties. If you're going to do something, it needs to be now." Sarah looked at Patterson, then at the tactical display, then at the flight line visible through the operations center window where a single Apache helicopter sat fueled and ready. She was about to make a decision that would change everything. Not just for her, but for the 8 people whose lives hung in the balance 60 miles away. Time slowed to a crawl in the operations center as Sarah Mitchell stared at the tactical display showing her former squadron's desperate situation. Every few seconds, Morrison's voice crackled over the radio with increasingly urgent updates that painted a picture of impending disaster. Base, this is Desert Shield 1. Enemy fire is intensifying. We have 1 KIA, 2 EI, and we're running low on defensive ammunition. Request immediate extraction, or we're not going to make it out of here. Colonel Patterson's face was etched with the weight of command as he responded. Desert Shield 1, understand your situation. We are working on extraction options. Hold your position and continue to defend. But Sarah could see in Patterson's eyes what he couldn't say over the radio. There were no good options. Every scenario the staff officers had developed required either unacceptable risk to additional personnel or time they simply didn't have. Major Lisa Hendricks, the operations officer, approached Patterson with another update that made the situation even more dire. Sir, intelligence is reporting Taliban reinforcements moving toward Checkpoint Bravo. If they arrive before we can extract our people, a rescue becomes impossible. Sarah's mind raced through the tactical possibilities. She knew the terrain around Checkpoint Bravo better than anyone in the operations center. She'd flown combat missions in that area for 3 years, understood the wind patterns, the approach vectors, the defensive positions. More importantly, she understood the Apache helicopter's capabilities in ways that textbook knowledge couldn't match. The solution was obvious, sitting right there on the flight line. Tail number 06, 18473, fully fueled, fully armed, and ready for combat. The same type of aircraft she'd been flying for over a decade. The only thing standing between that helicopter and a rescue mission was her grounded status and the direct orders that prohibited her from flying. Patterson noticed her staring at the tactical display with the intense focus he'd seen countless times before when she was planning a mission. Mitchell, I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no. Sarah turned to face her commanding officer. Sir, with respect, I'm not thinking anything. I'm just trying to understand our options. Our options don't include putting a grounded pilot back in a cockpit. You're not cleared for flight operations, and that's final. But even as Patterson spoke those words, Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a career officer who believed in following orders and maintaining discipline, but he was also a soldier who had sworn to leave no one behind. The lives of 8 people hung in the balance, and the only immediate solution was standing right in front of him in the form of his most experienced, albeit insubordinate, pilot. Lieutenant Rivera's voice suddenly cut through the radio chatter with a transmission that changed everything. Base, this is Desert Shield 2. Captain Stevens is unconscious from blood loss. I'm trying to control his bleeding, but he needs immediate medical attention. We can't hold this position much longer. Sarah closed her eyes, processing the tactical situation with the clarity that had made her legendary among her peers. Rivera was young, barely out of flight school, trapped in hostile territory with a wounded pilot and dwindling ammunition. Morrison was pinned down 50 meters from his aircraft, unable to reach it due to accurate sniper fire. The ground crew was trapped in a bunker with limited defensive capabilities. In her mind, she could visualize the entire scenario. The valley where Checkpoint Bravo was located, the likely positions of the Taliban fighters based on their fields of fire, the approach routes that would provide the best tactical advantage for a rescue operation. She'd trained for scenarios exactly like this hundreds of times. Patterson, she said quietly, dropping the formal sir in a way that immediately got his attention. I can get them out. The operations center fell silent, except for the crackle of radio communications. Every staff officer, every enlisted specialist, every person in the room understood the magnitude of what Sarah had just offered. Patterson stared at her for a long moment. Captain Mitchell, you are grounded. You are specifically prohibited from flight operations. What you're suggesting is not just insubordination, it's potentially court-martial worthy. Yes, sir, it is. Sarah's voice was steady, without a trace of uncertainty. But those people are going to die if someone doesn't act now. And I'm the only pilot immediately available who can fly that mission. Major Hendricks stepped forward. Sir, there has to be another option. We can't just ignore regulations because the situation is difficult. Sarah turned to face the Major. Ma'am, what other options do we have? The rested crew won't be ready for 6 hours. Fixed-wing support can't operate danger close to friendlies in that terrain. Ground forces hours away. In military terms, there is no other option. The radio crackled again with Morrison's voice, now strained with desperation. Base, I can see enemy fighters moving into positions around our perimeter. If they complete their encirclement, extraction becomes impossible. Patterson walked to the window overlooking the flight line. In the distance, he could see the Apache helicopter that represented both salvation and potential disaster. If he authorized Sarah to fly, he would be directly violating General Hayes' orders and potentially ending his own career. If he didn't authorize the flight, 8 of his people would likely die. Sarah followed him to the window. "Sir, I know what this means for both of us. I know you'll have to court-martial me when this is over. I know you'll probably face disciplinary action for allowing it, but those people down there trusted us to have their backs. They trusted us to do whatever it takes to bring them home." Patterson was quiet for a long moment, staring at the helicopter that could save his people or destroy his career. "Mitchell, if I authorize this, it's not just your career on the line, it's mine too. General Hayes will have both our heads. Sir, I can live with a court-martial. I can't live with letting those people die when I had the power to save them." The radio suddenly erupted with the sound of automatic gunfire and explosions. Through the chaos, Rivera's voice came through, high-pitched with fear and adrenaline. Base, they're attacking our position. Captain Stevens is critical. We need help now." Patterson closed his eyes, the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical force. Every regulation, every principle of military discipline told him to wait for authorized assets, to follow proper procedures, to maintain order and discipline. But every instinct as a soldier and as a human being told him that sometimes rules matter less than lives. When he opened his eyes and looked at Sarah, she saw the decision in his face before he spoke the words. "You didn't hear this from me," Patterson said quietly, his voice barely audible above the radio chatter. "And if anyone asks, I was in the latrine and had no idea what you were doing." Sarah nodded, understanding the enormous risk Patterson was taking. "Sir, if this goes bad, you acted without authorization while I was indisposed. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." Patterson turned away from the window. "I need to step outside for some air. I expect I'll be gone for at least 30 minutes. Major Hendricks, you have the operations center." As Patterson walked out, Major Hendricks stared at Sarah with a mixture of admiration and horror. "Captain, you realize what you're doing is career suicide." "Maybe," Sarah replied, already mentally shifting into mission planning mode. "But it's the right thing to do." Sarah spent the next 5 minutes in the most intense mission planning session of her career. She studied the tactical display, analyzed the terrain, calculated fuel loads and ammunition requirements. She memorized the radio frequencies, confirmed the weather conditions, and visualized every aspect of the approach and extraction. The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. She would fly a single-ship mission directly to Checkpoint Bravo, using the Apache's speed and firepower to suppress enemy positions long enough to extract the trapped personnel. It was dangerous, potentially suicidal, and completely unauthorized. It was also the only chance those 8 people had of making it home alive. As she prepared to leave the operations center, Master Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at her side. "Captain," he said quietly, "I don't know what you're planning, but whatever it is, you're going to need help with pre-flight." Sarah looked at the grizzled NCO who had become her supervisor during her grounding. "Sergeant, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking, ma'am. I'm volunteering. Those boys down there are somebody's sons. They deserve to come home." Within minutes, word had somehow spread through the base about what was happening. As Sarah walked toward the flight line, she found herself surrounded by mechanics, crew chiefs, and support personnel who had happened to be in the area. No one said anything directly, but everyone understood what was about to occur. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, the crew chief for tail number 06. 18473 was already running pre-flight checks when Sarah arrived at the aircraft. "Ma'am," Santos said without looking up, "this bird is ready to fly. Full fuel, full ammunition load, all systems green." Sarah climbed into the familiar cockpit of the Apache helicopter. Her hands moved automatically over the controls, muscle memory taking over as she began the startup sequence she'd performed thousands of times before. The twin turboshaft engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and the aircraft came alive beneath her hands. For the first time in 3 days, Sarah Mitchell felt like herself again. As she completed her pre-flight checks, she keyed her radio to the base frequency. "Operations, this is Apache 76 requesting immediate departure clearance for emergency rescue mission." Major Hendricks' voice came back, carefully neutral. "Apache 76, be advised that no such mission has been authorized. Operations, understand. This is an unauthorized emergency rescue flight. Departing immediately. Sarah lifted the Apache off the flight line and turned toward the mountains, where her former squadron was fighting for their lives. As the base fell away behind her, she realized she was either flying toward redemption or toward the end of everything she'd ever worked for. Either way, she was flying again, and 8 people were counting on her to bring them home. The desert landscape rushed beneath her as she pushed the Apache to maximum cruise speed. In 35 minutes, she would either be a hero or a criminal. But for the first time in 3 days, Captain Sarah Mitchell felt like a pilot again. The Apache helicopter cut through the desert air like a weapon forged for this exact moment. Sarah Mitchell pushed the aircraft to its maximum cruise speed of 227 miles per hour, the twin General Electric turboshaft engines screaming at full power as she raced against time and death toward Checkpoint Bravo. Flying alone violated every protocol in the Apache manual. The aircraft was designed for a 2-person crew, pilot and co-pilot gunner working in perfect coordination. But Sarah had no choice. Every minute of delay meant her former squadron moved closer to being overrun by Taliban forces that were reportedly reinforcing their positions around the trapped Americans. 35 minutes to target. Sarah used every second of flight time to refine her tactical plan. The terrain around Checkpoint Bravo was a bowl-shaped valley surrounded by ridge lines that provided perfect vantage points for the enemy fighters. Standard Apache tactics called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, but she was flying a single-ship mission into what was essentially a shooting gallery. Through her headset, she monitored the increasingly desperate radio communications from the trapped personnel. Morrison's voice had taken on the flat, controlled tone that experienced soldiers used when they knew they were probably going to die. Base, this is Desert Shield 1. Enemy forces have us completely surrounded. We're down to our last magazines, and Captain Stevens needs immediate medical evacuation, or he's not going to make it. Rivera's younger voice cut through the static, high with stress and fear. Base, I can see at least 20 fighters moving into positions on the North Ridge. They're setting up what looks like heavy machine guns. When they get those in position, we're finished. Sarah keyed her radio, switching to the frequency her trapped squadron was using. Desert Shield 1, Desert Shield 2, this is Apache 7-6 inbound to your position. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Morrison's voice came back, confused and cautious. Apache 7-6, identify yourself. We weren't expecting any additional assets. Sarah hesitated for just a moment. Once she identified herself, there would be no going back, no pretending this was anything other than what it was. A grounded pilot stealing an aircraft to save her friends. Desert Shield 1, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell. I'm inbound in a single Apache for immediate extraction. This time the silence lasted even longer. When Morrison finally responded, his voice carried a mixture of relief, amazement, and concern. Sarah, what the hell are you doing? You're grounded. Yeah, well, apparently I don't follow orders very well, Sarah replied, allowing herself a tight smile. What's your tactical situation? Morrison quickly briefed her on the enemy positions, casualty status, and the deteriorating defensive situation. As she listened, Sarah's mind processed the information and refined her attack plan. She would have one chance to get this right. If she failed, 9 people would die instead of 8. 20 minutes to target. Sarah began her descent from cruising altitude, dropping the Apache to 500 feet above ground level to stay below enemy radar coverage. The mountainous terrain provided some concealment, but as she approached the valley where Checkpoint Bravo was located, she would be exposed to fire from multiple directions. The plan she'd developed was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. She would approach the valley at high speed and low altitude, using the Apache's 30mm chain gun to suppress enemy positions, while simultaneously calling in her own coordinates for indirect fire support from the base's artillery batteries. Then she would land in the middle of the fight, load the wounded and trapped personnel, and attempt to escape before the enemy could react. It was, by any reasonable military standard, a suicide mission. 15 minutes to target. Sarah could see the distinctive terrain features that marked the approach to Checkpoint Bravo. Smoke was visible in the distance, rising from the burning fuel truck that had been struck in the initial ambush. Through her Apache's targeting system, she could already detect the heat signatures of multiple personnel in defensive positions. Rivera's voice came over the radio again, now barely controlled. Any Apache inbound, we are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Captain Stevens is unconscious and bleeding badly. We need immediate extraction. Desert Shield 2, this is Apache 7-6, Sarah responded. I'll be over your position in 15 minutes. Start marking your positions with strobes and prepare for immediate extraction. Apache 7-6, Morrison cut in. The LZ is completely compromised. There's no way you can land in this mess. Sarah checked her weapons systems one final time. Full load of Hellfire missiles, 625 rounds of 30mm ammunition, and enough fuel for the mission plus a small reserve. It would have to be enough. Desert Shield 1, I didn't fly 60 miles to turn around now. Mark your positions and get ready to move. 10 minutes to target. Sarah could see the valley that contained Checkpoint Bravo spread out before her. Through her targeting system, she identified the muzzle flashes of enemy weapons positions, scattered throughout the ridgelines surrounding the valley. At least 30 fighters, just as intelligence had estimated, all with overlapping fields of fire that turned the valley floor into a killing zone. She also identified her primary target, the fuel truck that had been struck in the initial ambush, now burning fiercely near the center of the valley. The trapped Apache helicopters were visible nearby, one clearly damaged beyond flight capability, the other potentially flyable if she could suppress enemy fire long enough for Morrison to reach it. Sarah switched her radio to the artillery frequency and began calling in fire missions on the enemy positions. Thunder Base, this is Apache 7-6. Fire mission, grid coordinates follow. She rattled off the coordinates for the most dangerous enemy positions, requesting high explosive rounds to impact just as she began her attack run. If the timing worked perfectly, the artillery would suppress the enemy just as she entered the valley, giving her a few crucial seconds to establish fire superiority. 5 minutes to target. Sarah pushed the Apache into a shallow dive, accelerating to maximum attack speed as she approached the valley. Through her headset, she could hear the countdown from the artillery battery. Shot. Over. Splash in 30 seconds. This was the moment that would define her entire military career. Everything she'd trained for, everything she'd worked toward, came down to the next few minutes. She was either about to pull off one of the most audacious rescue missions in aviation history, or she was about to become another casualty statistic. All stations, this is Apache 7-6 beginning attack run. Keep your heads down. Sarah brought the Apache screaming into the valley just as the first artillery rounds impacted the ridge lines. The explosion sent Taliban fighters scrambling for cover, temporarily disrupting their coordinated fire. She immediately opened fire with the 30mm chain gun, walking explosive rounds across the most threatening enemy positions. The Apache shuddered as enemy bullets struck its armored hull. The Taliban fighters were disciplined and well-trained, recovering from the artillery barrage faster than Sarah had hoped. Tracer rounds streaked past her cockpit as she maneuvered the helicopter in an aggressive attack pattern designed to keep the enemy off balance. Desert Shield 1, where are you? Sarah called as she suppressed an enemy machine gun position with a burst of 30mm fire. North side of the burning truck, behind the concrete barriers, Morrison responded. Sarah spotted the group of trapped personnel huddled behind makeshift cover near the center of the valley. Stevens was clearly visible, unconscious and being tended to by Rivera, while Morrison and the surviving ground crew maintained defensive positions. The landing zone was a nightmare. Enemy fire was coming from 3 different ridgelines, the ground was littered with debris from the destroyed fuel truck, and there was barely enough clear space to land the Apache without hitting the damaged helicopters already on the ground. Sarah made her decision with the split-second timing that separated great pilots from dead ones. She brought the Apache into a combat landing, touching down hard just 50 meters from the trapped personnel while continuing to engage enemy positions with her chin-mounted gun. "Move! Move! Move!" she screamed over the radio. What happened next would be talked about in aviation circles for decades. Morrison and his team, displaying the kind of courage that medals are made of, sprinted across 50 meters of open ground under heavy enemy fire. Rodriguez, despite having no combat training, helped carry the unconscious Stevens toward the Apache. Rivera provided covering fire with his sidearm until he ran out of ammunition. Sarah kept the Apache's engines running while laying down suppressing fire with everything she had. The 30mm gun chattered continuously, sending explosive rounds into enemy positions. When she ran low on 30mm ammunition, she fired 2 Hellfire missiles at Taliban positions on the North Ridge, the explosions temporarily silencing several machine gun nests. Loading 8 people into an Apache helicopter designed for a 2-person crew was like solving a deadly puzzle. Stevens, unconscious and seriously wounded, had to be secured in the narrow space behind the pilot seats. Rivera squeezed into the co-pilot gunner position, while Morrison and the remaining ground crew personnel packed themselves into every available space in the aircraft. The Apache was now carrying nearly twice its designed crew capacity. The additional weight would affect its performance, making it slower to climb and less maneuverable. Sarah would have to compensate for these limitations while flying out of a valley filled with enemy fighters. "Everyone in?" she called over the intercom. "Go, go, go," Morrison responded. Sarah pulled power and lifted the overloaded Apache off the ground just as a Taliban fighter fired an RPG at their position. The rocket-propelled grenade impacted where they'd been sitting just seconds before, sending debris clanging against the helicopter's armored hull. Now came the most dangerous part of the mission, getting out of the valley alive. With the Apache overloaded and low on ammunition, Sarah had to use every bit of skill and experience she had accumulated over 12 years of flying. She kept the helicopter low, using terrain features to mask their movement while climbing toward the ridgeline that would take them out of the valley. Enemy fire followed them every foot of the way. Bullets sparked off the Apache's armor, while Sarah threw the aircraft into a vase of maneuvers that pushed both the helicopter and its human cargo to their limits. In the back, Morrison was trying to provide medical aid to Stevens, while Rivera operated the defensive systems he'd been trained on but had never used in actual combat. The ridgeline loomed ahead, representing safety if they could just reach it. But as Sarah pulled the Apache into a climbing turn, a Taliban fighter with a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile acquired a lock on their aircraft. The missile warning tone filled the cockpit with its urgent beeping. Sarah had perhaps 3 seconds to react before the missile impacted their aircraft and killed everyone aboard. This was the moment that would determine whether her unauthorized rescue mission ended in triumph or tragedy. Everything came down to the next few seconds of flying. And Sarah Mitchell had never been more focused in her entire life. The missile streaked toward them through the desert air, and Sarah threw the Apache into the most aggressive evasive maneuver of her career, knowing that the lives of 8 people depended on her ability to cheat death one more time. The surface-to-air missile streaked through the desert air with deadly precision, its heat-seeking warhead locked onto the Apache's twin-engine exhausts. Sarah Mitchell had perhaps 2 seconds to save 9 lives, including her own. She threw the overloaded helicopter into a maneuver that pushed both machine and human endurance to their absolute limits. The Apache rolled inverted and dove toward the valley floor, while Sarah simultaneously deployed flares and chaff, filling the air with decoy signatures designed to confuse the incoming missile. The missile, tracking on the hottest heat source it could detect, locked onto a flare and detonated 50 feet above and behind the Apache. The explosion sent shrapnel clanging against the helicopter's armored hull, but the aircraft remained flyable. "Holy shit!" Rivera screamed over the intercom as the Apache rolled upright and climbed toward the ridgeline. Sarah didn't respond. Every fiber of her concentration was focused on flying the overloaded helicopter out of the kill zone, while enemy fighters continued to fire at them from multiple positions. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit as she used every fold in the terrain to mask their escape. Behind her, Morrison was working frantically to keep Captain Stevens alive. The wounded pilot had lost significant blood and was showing signs of shock. Without immediate medical attention, he would die within the hour. "Sarah, Stevens is critical," Morrison called over the intercom. "We need to get him to a hospital now." "Working on it," Sarah replied through gritted teeth as she maneuvered around another burst of machine gun fire. The ridgeline that marked safety was just ahead. Once they cleared it, they would be out of range of the Taliban fighters and could make a direct run to the base hospital. But the Apache was struggling under its excessive weight, climbing sluggishly toward the rocky outcropping that represented salvation. Sarah coaxed every bit of performance from the aircraft, adjusting power settings and flight controls with the precision of a surgeon. The Apache's twin engines were operating at maximum power, their turbine temperatures running dangerously high, but they continued to pull the helicopter upward. A final burst of enemy fire chased them over the ridgeline, bullets sparking off rocks just below the landing gear. Then they were clear, flying over empty desert with the immediate threat behind them. But the mission wasn't over yet. Stevens was dying in the back of the helicopter, and the nearest trauma hospital was still 25 minutes away at the main base. Sarah radioed ahead, requesting priority landing clearance and a medical team standing by. "Base operations, this is Apache 7-6 inbound with 8 personnel, 1 urgent surgical. Request immediate medical response and priority landing clearance." The voice that came back belonged to Major Hendricks, carefully professional despite the circumstances. "Apache 7-6, medical team is standing by. You are cleared for direct approach to the hospital landing pad." As Sarah flew toward base, she could hear Rivera in the co-pilot seat trying to process what had just happened. The young lieutenant had gone from routine patrol to combat rescue in the span of a few hours, and the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. "Captain," Rivera said quietly, "what's going to happen when we land?" Sarah knew exactly what was going to happen. Court-martial proceedings, probably a prison sentence, and the end of her military career. She'd stolen an aircraft, disobeyed direct orders, and engaged in unauthorized combat operations. By any military standard, she was guilty of multiple serious offenses. I honestly don't know, Rivera, she replied, but Stevens is going to live, and that's what matters. The base appeared on the horizon, its familiar buildings and flight lines representing both safety and judgment. Sarah could see the medical team already waiting at the hospital landing pad, along with what appeared to be half the base command structure. She brought the Apache in for the smoothest landing of her career, touching down with barely a bump despite the aircraft's excessive weight. As soon as the skids touched concrete, medical personnel rushed forward to extract Stevens from the helicopter. The unconscious pilot was loaded onto a stretcher and rushed into the hospital within minutes of landing. The other rescued personnel were checked for injuries and debriefed by intelligence officers who were trying to understand exactly what had happened at Checkpoint Bravo. As Sarah shut down the Apache's engines and completed her post-flight checks, she could see Colonel Patterson approaching the aircraft with an expression that mixed relief, anger, and resignation. Behind him walked General Hayes, who had apparently been summoned to deal with the situation personally. Sarah climbed out of the cockpit and stood at attention as Patterson and the general approached. She was still wearing her flight gear, still carrying the helmet she wasn't authorized to wear, still representing everything that military discipline was designed to prevent. "Captain Mitchell," General Hayes said without preamble, "you are under arrest for multiple violations of military law, including theft of military property, disobeying direct orders, and unauthorized engagement in combat operations." Sarah didn't flinch. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Sarah looked at the general, then at Patterson, then at the hospital where Captain Stevens was fighting for his life with the help of the medical team that was able to treat him because she'd brought him home.
Ma'am, I swore an oath to defend my fellow soldiers.
Captain Stevens and 7 other people are alive today because I honored that oath. I accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate. General Hayes studied her for a long moment. "Captain, your actions today saved 8 lives. They also represent the most serious breach of military discipline I've encountered in 23 years of service. I honestly don't know whether to court-martial you or recommend you for a medal." Over the next several hours, Sarah found herself at the center of a bureaucratic storm that reached all the way to the Pentagon. Her unauthorized rescue mission had succeeded beyond all expectations, but it had also created a precedent that military leadership couldn't ignore. The investigation that followed was thorough and swift. Military investigators interviewed every person involved, from the rescued personnel to the base support staff who had happened to assist with the pre-flight preparations. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah had clearly and deliberately violated multiple orders and regulations. But the evidence also showed something else. 8 American service members were alive because of her actions, and there had been no other viable option for their rescue. The court-martial convened 2 weeks later in a packed hearing room at the base. Military lawyers argued about precedent, regulations, and the importance of discipline in maintaining military effectiveness. Character witnesses, including every member of her rescued squadron, testified about Sarah's dedication, skill, and commitment to her fellow soldiers. Captain Stevens recovered enough to testify despite still being on medical leave, provided the most powerful testimony of all. "Your Honor," he said from the witness stand, "Captain Mitchell saved my life and the lives of 7 other people. She did it knowing that it would cost her career. That's not insubordination. That's heroism." The court-martial board deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the situation Sarah had created. "Captain Sarah Mitchell," the presiding judge announced, "this court finds you guilty of violating direct orders, unauthorized use of military equipment, and engaging in combat operations without authorization." Sarah stood at attention, prepared for the sentence that would end her military career. "However," the judge continued, "this court also recognizes that your actions resulted in the rescue of 8 American service members who would otherwise have been killed or captured. In light of the extraordinary circumstances and the successful outcome of your actions, this court sentences you to a reprimand and reduction in rank to first lieutenant, with immediate reinstatement to flight status." The courtroom erupted in applause from the packed gallery of soldiers who had come to support Sarah. It was an almost unprecedented decision that balanced military discipline with recognition of exceptional courage under impossible circumstances. General Hayes approached Sarah after the court-martial concluded. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she said with a slight smile, "you are hereby assigned as the new commander of our combat rescue squadron. Apparently, we need someone who understands that sometimes the most important orders are the ones we give ourselves. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell, now Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell after a rapid promotion, stood on the same flight line where she'd stolen an Apache helicopter to save her friends. She was watching a new group of pilots prepare for a training mission when Colonel Patterson approached. "Any regrets?" he asked, referring to the events that had changed both their careers. Sarah looked at the Apache helicopters on the flight line, then at the hospital where Captain Stevens had recovered fully and returned to flight status, then at the memorial wall where the names of the 2 ground crew members killed in the initial ambush were now inscribed. "Sir, I regret that 2 good people died before I could get there," she said. "I regret that I had to break regulations to do what was right, but I don't regret saving those 8 lives, and I'd do it again tomorrow if I had to." Patterson nodded. "That's what I figured you'd say. For what it's worth, Mitchell, you made the right choice. Not the legal choice, not the regulation choice, but the right choice." As Patterson walked away, Sarah climbed into the cockpit of her Apache helicopter, now legally and officially hers to fly. The familiar controls responded to her touch as she began her pre-flight checks, preparing for another mission in service of the oath she'd taken to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. Lieutenant Rivera, now promoted to captain and serving as her co-pilot, settled into the gunner's seat behind her. "Ready for another routine patrol, ma'am?" he asked with a grin. Sarah smiled as she started the twin-turbine engines, their familiar whine filling the cockpit with the sound of controlled power. "Rivera," she said, "I've learned that there's no such thing as a routine patrol. There are only missions that matter and missions that matter more." As they lifted off into the desert sky, Sarah Mitchell reflected on the strange path that had led her from grounded pilot to squadron commander. She'd learned that sometimes the greatest acts of courage require breaking the very rules designed to prevent them. She'd learned that heroism isn't about following orders, it's about knowing which orders are worth breaking. Most importantly, she'd learned that being grounded doesn't mean you stop flying. Sometimes it just means you learn what's truly worth taking off for. The Apache helicopter climbed into the clear desert sky, carrying 2 pilots who understood that the most important missions are often the ones nobody authorizes. Behind them, 8 people were alive to see another sunrise because sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing matters more than doing the legal thing. In the military, they call it leaving no one behind. Sarah Mitchell had learned that sometimes that promise requires breaking every other rule in the book. And she'd learned that when it comes to saving lives, that's a trade she'd make every single time.